My husband insisted I stay home while he went on a luxurious vacation with his friends. This trip is for successful people only, they laughed. I quietly packed my bags and left without a word. Hours later he begged me to come back. But it was too late. It was a moment I'll never forget, a turning point that changed everything. The phone call came in the middle of a regular Tuesday morning, a seemingly ordinary moment, but it shattered my world. I didn't expect it. Who could have? My husband Mark was on the other end, his voice dripping with an arrogance I hadn't heard in a while. I think you should stay home while I go on this trip with the guys, he said casually, as if it was no big deal. It's for successful people only, he added, a laugh escaping his lips, and I could practically hear his friends snickering in the background. You know, it's a boys' trip. You wouldn't be comfortable. Before we dive deeper into this powerful journey of self-discovery and strength, I want to thank you for joining us. If you resonate with stories of transformation and resilience, hit that subscribe button. It's free and helps us continue to bring you these life-changing narratives. Let's get started. I had known for a while that things between us were fraying, but this felt like the final straw. The words echoed in my mind, each one slicing deeper into me. For successful people only. It wasn't just a joke. It wasn't just a passing comment. It was a judgment. A declaration that I wasn't worthy of his world, that I didn't belong in the spaces he frequented anymore. I had spent so many years giving my all to our marriage to him, but now I was being discarded like some worn-out piece of clothing. And worse, he didn't even realize the hurt in his words. I sat there in stunned silence, the phone still pressed to my ear, listening as Mark rambled on about the trip. He spoke of the luxury hotels, the exclusive clubs, and the extravagant dinners. He mentioned things I couldn't afford on my own, things he would never let me forget. I'll be gone for a week. Take it easy, okay? You deserve a break. There it was again, his condescending tone. A break. Wasn't it him who needed a break from me? I didn't speak for a long moment, trying to process the sheer audacity of it all. I could feel the weight of his words pressing down on me, the weight of his dismissal. I wanted to yell, to scream, to demand an explanation. But I didn't. Instead, I felt this overwhelming calmness wash over me, as if a switch had flipped inside me. All right, I said finally, my voice steady, almost unnervingly so. I'll stay home. Have fun on your trip, Mark. The words felt hollow, like they came from a stranger. It wasn't the response he expected, but it was the one he got. He chuckled lightly and said goodbye, completely unaware that he had just triggered something in me. I hung up, feeling a strange sense of clarity. For the first time in years, I wasn't angry. I wasn't sad. I wasn't anything. I was numb. But beneath that numbness was something much stronger. Something I hadn't realized had been building up for years. A desire. A need. To prove him wrong. To prove to myself that I was worth more than the way he had reduced me to nothing. I walked into our bedroom and without a second thought I began to pack my bags. The house, which had once been filled with laughter and love, now felt cold. The walls seemed to close in on me as I folded my clothes with care. I didn't rush. I didn't have to. There was no need for drama, no need for confrontation. I was going to leave and I was going to do it quietly. Mark would never know until it was too late. I wasn't angry with him anymore. I was done. I had been done for a long time, but this moment, this call, had crystallized everything for me. I packed my bags slowly, methodically, as if I were preparing for a long journey, one I wasn't sure I'd return from. I didn't look back. I couldn't. If I did, I knew I might second-guess myself. I wasn't going to second-guess. I had made my decision and now all I had to do was carry it out. Once everything was packed, I stood in front of the mirror, examining myself. Who was I now? I didn't recognize the woman in the reflection. She was strong but also lost. I had spent so many years building my life around someone else, living in the shadow of their dreams, their ambitions, their successes. But in that moment I realized something. I had lost myself along the way. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about me, my future, and what I could become on my own. I left the house without a sound. I didn't want to make a scene. There was no need to. I was done with the drama. My heart didn't race, my hands didn't shake. It was as if I had already mourned the death of our marriage long before this moment, and now I was simply moving on. I walked out the front door, leaving it wide open. The cold air hit me, a stark contrast to the warmth I had just left behind. But it didn't matter. I wasn't going back. Not to that house, not to that life. As I drove away, I didn't look back. There were no tears, no regrets. I was free. Hours later, I received a text from Mark. "Where are you?" he asked, his tone noticeably more frantic now. "Why didn't you say anything? This isn't funny." But it wasn't funny. Not at all. It was real. I had left and there was no going back now. I didn't answer his text. I didn't need to. I was no longer the woman who waited at home for him to make time for me. I was no longer the one who was invisible in his eyes. I was someone else now. Someone new. By the time he realized what had happened, it was already too late. And when he begged for me to come back, when he promised to change, I knew I had made the right decision. But that's a story for later. For now, all I could do was drive, away from the life I had once known, towards something better, something I had yet to discover. It was the beginning of the end, and it felt like the start of something entirely new. As I drove farther away from my home, the reality of the situation settled in. I wasn't just leaving a house behind. I was leaving years of my life, years of love, sacrifice, and devotion that had been overlooked and dismissed. There were so many moments, so many flashes of memory that played in my mind as I sped down the road. For a long time, I had convinced myself that I could be patient, that I could be the one to wait for him to change, to recognize what I was offering him. I had believed in us. I had believed in our love. But now it felt like I was leaving behind someone I didn't even recognize anymore. Someone who had sacrificed so much just to please him. I remember when we first met. It was at a friend's wedding, a day full of laughter, music, and the kind of hopeful energy that only a wedding could bring. I wasn't looking for anything serious. I had always been focused on my career, my goals, and I had built my life around the idea that I didn't need anyone else to be happy. But then Mark came along. He was charming, confident, and full of ambition. He made me feel seen in a way that no one else ever had. His words were always reassuring, his promises always steadfast. He spoke of his dreams and aspirations, and it was clear that he was someone who would go far in life. At first, it seemed like I had found someone who could keep up with me. He made me believe in the future we could build together. For a while, everything was perfect. We moved in together, started planning our future, and I threw myself into being his partner, his confidant, and his equal. I was his biggest cheerleader, pushing him to pursue his goals, supporting him when things got tough. I believed in him. No, I believed in us. He was the man I had always dreamed of. And for a time he was the man I wanted to spend the rest of my life with. But somewhere along the way things began to change. Slowly at first and then more quickly until it felt like I was walking down a path I didn't even recognize. Mark became consumed by his career, by his social circle, and by the image he was creating for himself. He no longer seemed interested in spending time with me the way he once had. The nights we spent talking about our future turned into late nights at the office or out with friends. The things I had once loved about him, his ambition, his drive, started to feel like walls between us. He was so focused on success that he couldn't see what was slipping away right in front of him. At first, I tried to make excuses for him. He was busy, he was stressed, he was building something for our future. But then came the small things, the subtle dismissals, the way he would brush off my concerns or make jokes at my expense. It wasn't outright cruelty, but it was enough to make me feel small. There was always a reason why I couldn't join him on his trips, why I couldn't attend the events he went to, why I wasn't successful enough to be part of his world. Each time he said something like that, it chipped away at my self-esteem just a little more. And then came the moment that I'll never forget, the moment that solidified everything for me. It wasn't a big argument or a dramatic confrontation. No, it was something far worse. It was the moment I realized that the man I had fallen in love with wasn't the man I was married to anymore. It happened one evening when he came home from one of his boys' nights. A few drinks too many and a look in his eyes that I had come to dread. He had this air about him, this aura of superiority, as though everything he was doing was for the greater good, for the sake of us. But when I looked at him, all I saw was a man who had lost sight of what truly mattered. I had been working on a project, one that I was really proud of, something that I had invested a lot of time and energy into. It was important to me, and when I mentioned it to him, he didn't even look up from his phone. "That's nice, babe," he muttered, his tone distant, distracted. And then with a smirk he added, "You should really focus on your career, you know. You'd be happier if you were more like me, successful, busy, on the move." It wasn't the first time he had said something like that, but it was the first time it hit me so deeply. I had spent so many years supporting him, sacrificing my own dreams, trying to fit into his world. But in that moment I realized I was nothing more than a footnote in his life. He wasn't interested in me anymore, he was interested in the image of success he was building, in his friends who fed into that image, and in the life he had created for himself. That moment was a wake-up call. It wasn't just about the trip. It wasn't just about the mocking words he had said. It was about everything that had led up to that point. I had given so much of myself to this relationship, and yet, I had been pushed aside in favor of his own desires and ambitions. My needs, my feelings, my existence had become secondary to his. The night before the phone call, I had gone to bed feeling defeated. I didn't know what I was supposed to do anymore. I was emotionally drained, worn out by years of trying to fit into a life that didn't leave room for me. I wanted to leave, but I didn't know how. I had no plan, no idea of where I would go or what I would do next. But when he called me the next morning with his arrogant, dismissive tone, it all became clear. He had pushed me to the edge and I had finally decided to jump. It wasn't just the trip that did it. It was everything. His friends, his lifestyle, his obsession with success. It all made me feel invisible. But in that moment, as I sat there packing my bags, I knew that I was making the right decision. I was done being treated like I didn't matter. I was done being part of his world of shallow success. It was time for me to build my own world, one where I mattered. So I left. And as I drove away, I didn't look back. Not because I didn't care, but because I had finally realized that I had to care about myself first. I had to give myself the chance to find happiness on my own. I had to find the strength to walk away from a life that no longer served me. And as the miles between me and my old life grew longer, I could finally breathe a little easier, knowing that I had taken the first step toward reclaiming myself. As the days passed, I could feel the weight of my decisions settling in. The silence in the car was suffocating, yet liberating. I wasn't sure where I was heading, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going back. I had to remind myself that this was for me, not just for the sake of escaping the suffocating atmosphere at home, but for finding a version of myself that I had lost over the years. As I drove, my mind wandered back to the moments that had led up to this one. The betrayal wasn't just in that phone call. It was in every little thing he had done, every dismissive glance, every time I felt less than in his world. At first, I wasn't sure what exactly had changed. Mark had always been ambitious, driven, focused on his career. I admired that about him when we first met. It wasn't until later that I realized his ambition came at a cost. At the cost of the person who was supposed to be his partner. I had been so swept up in his world, so eager to please him, to fit into whatever role he needed me to play. I thought it was love. I thought it was sacrifice. But it was something else entirely. It was neglect. Looking back now, it's clear how the subtle shifts began. It wasn't a single moment, a single instance of cruel behavior. It was 1,000 little things that, over time, built up into an impenetrable wall between us. I had ignored the signs. I had convinced myself that the arguments were just bumps in the road, that everything would get better once he achieved his goals. But the truth was, it only got worse. When he said, "This trip is for successful people only," I wasn't just hurt, I was furious. That phrase felt like a slap across my face, a reminder that I wasn't part of his world anymore. He no longer saw me as his equal, his partner, his confidant. To him, I was a distraction from his pursuit of success. I had spent years supporting him, believing in him, in us. But when he used those words, it hit me that I was nothing more than an afterthought. The realization stung more than I could have imagined. I wasn't angry at him. I was angry at myself for having let it go on for so long. In the days that followed, I found myself drowning in a sea of confusion. I questioned everything. The relationship, the sacrifices, the way I had bent over backward to make him happy. Had it been worth it? Had I wasted all these years building something that was never meant to be? The questions gnawed at me like an incessant whisper in the back of my mind. But the anger, the frustration, they were louder. I was angry not just at Mark but at myself for allowing this to happen. How had I become so invisible in my own marriage? The silence between us was suffocating. Mark had tried reaching out. Texts, calls, even emails, but I ignored them all. I didn't know what to say, what I could possibly say. "Come back," he begged in one message. I didn't mean it. "Please, just give me another chance." But his words felt empty now, like a hollow echo of everything he had said in the past. He didn't even understand the gravity of what he had done. He was still caught up in his own world, in his own image of success. He thought a few words of apology could fix everything, but it was too late for that. The damage had been done and I wasn't going to be the one to pick up the pieces. Each message I received from him felt like a dagger. He didn't get it. He didn't see me, the real me, the one who had been there all along. He was too consumed with his own life to notice that I was drowning in mine. And yet there I was, driving away, feeling nothing but the sting of betrayal. I had believed in him for so long, believed in the idea of who he could be. But now I had to believe in myself. I had to trust that I was capable of living without him, that I didn't need to be defined by a relationship that had turned toxic. The anger was overwhelming. It consumed me in ways I hadn't expected. There were times when I wanted to scream, to throw things, to let out all the frustration that had built up over the years. But then there was a part of me that wanted to just cry. Cry for the woman I had been. The woman who had given everything for a love that had been one-sided. Cry for the version of me that had disappeared, that had been replaced by someone who didn't even know how to stand up for herself. I had been silenced for so long, and now I was left with nothing but the emptiness of the life I had built around someone else. But there was also a part of me that was starting to see the freedom in all of this. Yes, it hurt. Yes, I was angry. But I was also free. Free from the suffocating grip of a marriage that had become more about appearances than about love. Free from the person I had become. The person who had accepted being invisible in her own home. I was reclaiming myself one step at a time. In the quiet of my car, as I sped away from everything I had known, I began to plan. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I had to go somewhere. I couldn't just sit in this emptiness and let it consume me. I had to move forward. It wasn't just about leaving Mark behind. It was about leaving that version of me behind too. I couldn't be that woman anymore. I couldn't be the one who accepted being overlooked, ignored, and dismissed. So I planned. I made small, deliberate decisions. Where would I stay? What would I do next? I didn't know yet, but for the first time in years I didn't feel like I had to have all the answers right away. I just needed to keep moving forward. Every mile I put between myself and my old life felt like a victory. Each moment of silence on the road felt like a small act of rebellion against everything that had tried to hold me back. I would show Mark that I wasn't just a footnote in his life. I would show myself that I was worth more than the way he had treated me. I would prove that I could stand on my own, that I didn't need anyone to validate my worth. I had been my own person before I met him, and I could be that person again. I wasn't defined by his success. I was defined by my own strength, my own resilience, and my own ability to rise above the mess he had left behind. As the days passed and the distance between us grew, I felt something shift inside me. It wasn't just the anger anymore. It was something else. Something stronger. A quiet confidence began to grow, a belief that I was capable of more than I had ever imagined. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was living. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough. As the days rolled on, a calm sense of determination settled in. I had made my decision and there was no turning back. It wasn't just about escaping my marriage. It was about reclaiming my life, my identity, and my sense of self-worth. But that wasn't enough. I needed to make sure that Mark felt the gravity of what he had done, that he understood how deep the betrayal had cut. It wasn't just the words he had spoken during that phone call. It was the years of disregard, the way he had diminished me to a mere accessory in his life. If there was one thing I knew now, it was that I couldn't let him think he could walk away without consequences. The first step in my plan was simple. I needed time. Time away from him, time away from the life I had once known. I couldn't plan with him constantly sending messages, showing up at the door, pleading for me to come back. I needed to be free of him, to think clearly without the constant noise of his apologies and manipulations. I booked a small, quiet cabin in the mountains. It was secluded, peaceful, and away from everything. The first few days there were filled with an overwhelming sense of solitude, but I welcomed it. I needed to think, to process everything I had been through. I spent my time reflecting on my marriage, on Mark's behavior, on how I had allowed myself to be controlled by someone else for so long. Slowly, the pieces began to fall into place. I wasn't just angry anymore. I was strategic. Every detail of my revenge would be deliberate, calculated, and carefully executed. I didn't want to just hurt Mark. I wanted to make sure he felt the weight of the choices he had made. I wanted him to understand that his actions had consequences, and that he couldn't just discard me like an old pair of shoes. The first part of my plan was a quiet one. I needed to cut all ties. I blocked his number, deleted his messages, and cut off all communication with his friends. There would be no more apologies, no more distractions. It was just me now, and I had to stay focused on what was coming next. I knew Mark. I knew how he thought, how he operated. And I knew that if I just disappeared, he would try to move on quickly. He would tell himself that he was the victim, that I was the one who had abandoned him. I couldn't let that happen. I couldn't let him have the last word, especially after all the years of silence he had imposed on me. He needed to be exposed. He needed to feel the sting of betrayal just as I had. That's when the idea hit me. I would start with his friends, the ones who had been part of his little boys' club, the ones who had laughed at my expense. They were complicit in the way he had treated me. They had enabled him, supported his toxic behavior, and never once questioned how he treated me. It was time for them to see the truth. I didn't want to hurt them per se, but I needed to make sure that Mark saw just how alone he was. I reached out to a few of his closest friends, but not with the typical angry rant you might expect. No, I knew better than that. Instead, I played the part of someone who had moved on, someone who had found peace after the chaos. I told them that I was doing well, that I had found a new path, and that I was finally happy again. But I dropped a little bombshell in every conversation. A small seed of doubt. I didn't make accusations. I didn't need to. I just let the truth slip in a way that left them questioning everything. I told them that Mark wasn't who they thought he was, that he had kept secrets, that he had been dishonest, and that he had used them as a shield to protect his own image. I left it at that, knowing it would start to unravel. Next came the most important piece of my plan. Mark himself. He needed to feel like he was losing control, like his world was falling apart around him. I waited for him to make his next move. I knew he would eventually reach out again, trying to salvage whatever he could. I needed to be ready. When the call finally came, I was prepared. It was a typical plea for reconciliation, a desperate attempt to pull me back into his world of success and appearances. But this time, I wasn't the same woman who had once been consumed by his charm and promises. This time I was calm, composed, and focused on the bigger picture. "Please come back," he begged. "I made a mistake. I didn't mean what I said. This trip, the words, it was all a joke. I was just stressed out. I need you, you know that." I could hear the desperation in his voice, but I wasn't swayed. I knew he didn't truly regret his actions. He regretted losing his sense of control over me. I stayed silent for a moment, letting the weight of my silence hang in the air before I responded. "Mark, it's not about the trip. It's about everything. The way you've treated me. The way you've used me. I was never a part of your world. You made that clear, and I accepted it for far too long. But I'm done being invisible. I'm done being treated like I don't matter." He tried to interrupt, but I wouldn't let him. I had to keep going. "I'm not coming back," I said firmly. "And the worst part is that I'm not even angry anymore. I'm just done. But you will remember this, Mark. You'll remember how you lost me, and you'll understand that it wasn't just a bad decision. It was a pattern. A pattern of neglect, of selfishness. And you'll have to live with that." I could hear him breathing heavily on the other end, his frustration and confusion palpable. But there was something else in his voice now. Guilt. Genuine guilt. For the first time I could tell he realized the truth. I wasn't coming back. Not this time. And I wasn't going to make it easy for him. But I wasn't finished. I had one final piece of the puzzle to set into place. Something that would ensure he could never forget what he had lost. It wasn't about revenge in the traditional sense. It wasn't about hurting him physically or emotionally. It was about making sure he understood that I wasn't his to control anymore. That was the only way he could truly feel the weight of the betrayal. And as the call ended, I knew my plan was almost complete. What came next would change everything. When the phone call ended, I couldn't help but feel a strange mix of emotions. It was over. I had said everything I needed to say, but something inside me told me that Mark still hadn't fully grasped the weight of his actions. It wasn't enough just to leave, to walk away from the life we had built. I had to make sure he understood that I wasn't just a fleeting part of his past. I wasn't going to be another empty apology he could forget. He needed to feel the consequences of his behavior, and I wasn't going to make it easy for him. As I sat in the quiet of my cabin, the world outside seemed to still, as if nature itself was holding its breath in anticipation of what was coming. The plan had been set in motion, but the final act would be the most impactful. I had already spoken to his friends, letting the seeds of doubt take root. Now it was time for the truth to fully unravel. I wasn't interested in petty revenge. What I wanted was justice. The kind of justice that wasn't about causing pain, but about making him realize the deep, irrevocable damage he had done. A few days later, I received an unexpected message from one of his closest friends, David. He was someone I had always liked, someone I thought might have had a sense of decency. His message was brief but loaded with meaning. "Mark's been acting strange. You need to talk to him. He's a wreck. He says you've changed, but I can tell something happened." The text made me pause. This wasn't just about me anymore. The cracks were showing. Mark's world, his carefully crafted image, was starting to fracture. I didn't respond right away. I let the message sit there for a while, letting it simmer. I knew that Mark, in his desperation to fix everything, would reach out to the people around him. But this wasn't about rescuing him. It was about watching him finally face the consequences of the choices he had made. The next day I received another call. This time it was from Mark himself. His voice was strained, almost pleading. "Please," he begged, "can we just talk? I've realized what I've done, okay? I was wrong and I don't know what I'm supposed to do without you. Please come back." I could hear the desperation in his tone, but there was something different this time. Something more self-aware, as if he finally understood that the reality of losing me was starting to sink in. But it wasn't enough. I had no intention of returning to the past. My decision was final. I wasn't going to let him manipulate me with guilt anymore. I had done that for years and now it was time to break free, to move on and build the life I deserved. "You don't get it, Mark," I said, my voice steady, but with a quiet strength behind it. "It's not about you wanting me back. It's about me realizing that I'm worth more than what you gave me. I've spent too long in your shadow, accepting less than I deserved. You don't just get to snap your fingers and fix everything with an apology." There was a long silence on the other end, and for the first time, I felt as if I had his full attention. "I've already made my decision," I continued, each word heavy with finality. "I'm not coming back, Mark. I can't. And this time it's not because of the trip or your friends. It's because you never truly saw me. You never saw who I really was, and now I'm showing you. I'm walking away and you're going to have to live with that." The line went dead. I sat back in my chair, breathing deeply as the weight of the moment washed over me. It was done. I had said everything I needed to say and I had done what I had set out to do. Mark would have to figure out how to live with the truth, with the fact that he had lost someone who truly cared for him. The hardest part wasn't saying goodbye. It was realizing that he would never understand the depth of the hurt he had caused. But then, just as I thought I was done, I got a message that turned everything on its head. It was from one of Mark's friends, Jake, someone I had never really gotten along with. The message was brief, but it cut straight to the heart of everything that had been brewing beneath the surface. "I didn't want to be the one to tell you this," Jake wrote, "but Mark's been seeing someone else. I don't know how long it's been going on, but I thought you deserved to know." The world seemed to stop in that moment. I felt the ground shift beneath me. I had suspected something, a nagging feeling in the back of my mind, but to hear it confirmed was a shock I hadn't been prepared for. Mark had moved on. He hadn't just discarded me, he had replaced me. I didn't know what to feel in that moment. Anger? Betrayal? Sadness? It all flooded me at once, but beneath the chaos of emotions, there was a strange sense of relief. It wasn't me. It wasn't that I wasn't good enough. It was that he had never truly been committed to us. He had been living in a world of his own making, and when it no longer suited him, he had tossed me aside like an old coat. But the most significant realization came next. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even sad. I was free. For the first time in so long, I could breathe again. I didn't need his validation, his attention, or his promises. I had something he could never take away from me: my sense of self, my independence. And it was a feeling that filled me with strength. I reached for my phone and typed out a final message to Mark. It wasn't long. It wasn't filled with rage or spite. It was just the truth. "I know about her, Mark. I hope you're happy. You've made your choices and I've made mine. I'm done." I hit send. And just like that, the last chapter of our relationship closed. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of emotions, but they weren't the same ones I had experienced in the past. No longer was I waiting for him to come back, begging me to return. I had no desire to go back to a life that had held me captive for so long. I wasn't going to let him have the last word. I wasn't going to let him walk away with his head held high, thinking he had somehow won. I was the one who walked away. And that, in itself, was the sweetest revenge. As the days turned into weeks, I started to feel the weight of the choices I had made, but not in the way I had anticipated. I had expected to feel regret, to second-guess myself, but instead, a calm sense of clarity settled over me. I had done the right thing. Leaving Mark was the hardest decision I had ever made, but it was also the most liberating. Every day I felt myself becoming more and more confident in my ability to stand on my own, to take control of my life again. The woman who had once been so desperate for his approval, so consumed by the need to be seen, was no longer there. She had been replaced by someone who was strong, resilient, and fully aware of her worth. In the weeks following my final message to Mark, I began to rebuild. I focused on my work, on things that made me happy, and on reconnecting with friends and family I had neglected during my marriage. For the first time in years, I felt like I was living for myself, not for someone else's image of who I should be. I rediscovered parts of myself that I had long forgotten. Passions, hobbies, interests that had been pushed aside for the sake of a relationship that no longer served me. I found joy in small moments, reading a book without interruption, taking long walks in the park, or just sitting quietly with a cup of tea and letting my mind wander. But despite all the positive changes, there were still moments of doubt, moments when I questioned whether I had made the right decision. Late at night, when the silence of my apartment felt overwhelming, I would wonder what would have happened if I had tried harder, if I had been more patient, if I had stayed. It was in those quiet moments that I reminded myself of everything I had endured, everything I had given, and how little it had meant to him. I had sacrificed so much of myself, and in the end, Mark had made it clear that it was never enough. No amount of patience, no amount of love, could make him see me for who I truly was. He was too busy chasing his own version of success, too wrapped up in the life he thought he deserved to notice that I had become invisible in his eyes. As time passed, I found myself letting go of the anger. It wasn't an easy process, but I realized that holding on to resentment wasn't helping me heal. I had to forgive, not for him but for me. Forgiveness didn't mean forgetting. It meant releasing the hold his actions had on my life. It meant acknowledging that I had learned from the experience and that I had grown stronger because of it. I had the power to control my own happiness, to create a future that was filled with love, not for someone else but for myself. And then, just when I thought I was moving forward, something unexpected happened. Mark reached out again. It wasn't a call or a message, but something even more shocking. He showed up at my door one afternoon, standing there like a ghost from my past. He was different. His hair was disheveled, his clothes wrinkled, and there was a weariness in his eyes that I hadn't seen before. For the first time he seemed human, vulnerable even, and it made me hesitate for a moment. "I messed up," he said, his voice hoarse. "I know I can't undo the past, but I need you to know that I see what I lost. I've made mistakes, more than I can count. But I'm not asking you to come back. I'm asking for a chance to show you that I've changed. Not for you but for me. I was wrong and I'll live with that every day." For a moment I was caught off guard. I had prepared myself for this day, but seeing him standing there looking so broken, made my heart ache in a way I didn't expect. I wanted to tell him everything, the anger, the hurt, the pain. I wanted to scream at him for everything he had put me through. But instead I found myself taking a deep breath, calming my racing heart. "I'm glad you see it," I said quietly, my voice steady. "But the truth is, Mark, it's too late. You've had your chance. I gave you everything I had and you couldn't see me. You couldn't see the person who was standing right in front of you, loving you, supporting you. I'm not the same person anymore. I've moved on. I have to move forward. And I'm not waiting for you anymore." He stood there, silent for a long time, his face a mixture of regret and sorrow. I could see the tears welling up in his eyes, but I wasn't moved by them. They didn't change what had happened, and they didn't change the fact that I had already made peace with my decision. This was a chapter of my life I had closed, and I wasn't opening it again. With one final, lingering look, he turned and walked away. I didn't watch him go. I didn't need to. I had already made my peace. In the days that followed, I felt a strange sense of relief. There was no closure from him, no dramatic moment where he realized how much he had lost. But that was okay. I didn't need that from him anymore. The closure came from within. I had taken control of my life, and that was enough. I had faced the hardest thing I had ever done, and I had come out the other side stronger. I knew that moving forward wouldn't always be easy. There would be days when I would miss the comfort of companionship, the familiarity of shared memories. But I also knew that I was capable of creating my own happiness, my own future. I didn't need anyone to validate me. I had learned that the most important thing was to love myself first, to trust myself, and to never settle for less than I deserved. In the end, the lesson was simple yet profound. Sometimes the hardest thing to do is walk away, but it's also the most empowering. By choosing to let go, I was finally able to find the freedom I had been searching for all along.